6 days before I was supposed to hand my accountant the signed paperwork transferring the cabin and my RRRSP accounts into a family trust, I drove into town to pick up a prescription at Dawson's Pharmacy on Main Street. I had been coming to that pharmacy for 22 years. Since before my husband passed. Since before my knees started complaining on the stairs. Harriet Dawson, not the owner, just the woman who had worked the counter since before the original owner retired, had filled every prescription I'd ever had, knew which generics I'd accept and which ones I wouldn't, and always slipped a small butterscotch candy into the bag without being asked, the way she had since the first winter I came in shaking with a sinus infection. And she said, "You look like you need something sweet." She was at the counter when I came in that Tuesday afternoon. It was October, the tail end of the color in the trees, that week in the season when everything brilliant starts to let go. I pushed open the door and the bell chimed above me, and Harriet looked up from behind the counter, and her face did something I didn't recognize. Not a smile. Something tight, careful. The way you look at someone when you're holding very still inside. She came around the counter before I reached it, took my elbow. "Come with me," she said quietly. "Don't talk yet." She walked me through the back, past the shelves of supplements, and the blood pressure machine in the corner, through the door marked staff only, and into the small room where they kept the kettle and the lockers. She closed the door, turned off the overhead fluorescent. The only light came from the small window that faced the parking lot. "Harriet, what on earth?" She pressed one finger to her lips, then she pointed at the wall. The pharmacy shared a wall with the insurance office next door. That office had been quietly vacant since spring. It was not vacant now. Voices were coming through, low and distinct in the way that voices carry through old plaster walls when the rest of a building is quiet. A man's voice first, smooth, the voice of someone who charges by the hour and wants you to feel grateful for it. I recognized it immediately. My son-in-law's financial advisor, a man named Clifton Marsh, who my daughter had introduced me to 14 months ago. He had driven out to the cabin twice. He had a firm handshake and wore shoes that cost more than my car. Then my daughter's voice, measured, focused. The tone she used in meetings, the one she had developed somewhere in her 30s, when she stopped being the girl I raised and became someone I sometimes didn't quite recognize. "She hasn't asked about the trustee compensation structure," she said. "Good. Once the documentation is signed, the discretionary language kicks in. She won't be able to challenge a distribution without proving intent, and at her age, with the memory concerns we've documented, that's going to be very difficult to establish." I stopped breathing. Clifton Marsh said, "The assessment with Dr. Beaumont is set for the 22nd. I sent him the file last week. He's reviewed it. He's confident the evaluation will support a capacity review if it ever becomes necessary." My daughter said, "It needs to become necessary before the new year. We have the offer on the property in Kelowna. We need liquidity. The cabin alone is worth $430,000. The RRSPs are sitting at $380. Between what she has and what Derek's father left him when he passed, we're talking about do you understand what I'm saying? Actual freedom." Clifton Marsh said he understood. A chair moved. Footsteps. A door. Harriet turned the light back on. Her hands were shaking. Mine were not, which surprised me, because I felt as though I had been standing at the bottom of a lake. "They were here last week," she said. "Same wall, same conversation. I kept trying to decide if I was understanding it right. I didn't want to call you and be wrong." I looked at her for a long moment. "You weren't wrong," I said. I picked up my purse from the floor, where I must have set it down without knowing. I walked back through the pharmacy, through the front door and out into the October afternoon, where the trees were still beautiful and the sky over the lake was the flat gray of pewter, and everything looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes ago. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time. My daughter, 44 years old. I had driven her to ballet on Saturday mornings for 6 years. I had sat up through 2 nights when she had pneumonia at age 9, reading aloud from a library book about horses because that was the only thing that settled her. I had co-signed her first apartment lease. I had stood in the front pew at her wedding with flowers in my hand, and tears I wasn't embarrassed about because she had looked genuinely happy and I had been so glad for her. And Derek, her husband, 14 years of Christmases, a man who called me by my first name and helped me shovel the front walk the winter after my husband died without being asked. A man I had always believed, in some deep and unreflective way, was good. And Dr. Beaumont, a man I had not yet met who had already reviewed a file about my mind. I did not cry. I had used up a great deal of tears in the 3 years since my husband's death, and what was left in me that afternoon was something different, still, clear, very cold. I started the car. I drove home. The cabin was not a cabin in the way people from the city mean when they say cabin. It was a proper house on 60 acres of mixed forest outside of Merritt, British Columbia, with a wood stove in the kitchen and a dock that my husband had repaired board by board the summer before he died because he said he wanted to leave it right. We had bought it in 1991 with money we had saved for 7 years. We had raised our daughter there in the summers and some winters. My husband had died in the bedroom at the end of the hall 2.5 years ago, and I had never once considered leaving. $430,000 in property, $380,000 in RRSPs. 30 years of my husband building something slowly, carefully, doing without so that there would be something left. Actual freedom, my daughter had said. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the dock through the window. I called my friend Paulette first. Paulette Greer had been my closest friend for 27 years. We had worked together at the district school board, sat in the same staff meetings for a decade, driven each other to medical appointments, the year we both turned 60, and started paying attention to such things. She answered on the second ring and listened, without interrupting, which was not always her way but was exactly what I needed. She said, "You need Ellen Chow." Ellen Chow had handled my husband's estate. She was 57, precise, and not given to softening things unnecessarily, with 20 years in estate law before she shifted to general practice. Paulette had used her when her mother's will was contested. She knew what I was describing. I called Ellen's office and told her assistant it was urgent. Ellen called back within 40 minutes. I told her everything: the wall, the voices, the names, the trustee compensation structure, the property in Kelowna, Dr. Beaumont and his pre-reviewed file, the phrase actual freedom. The line was quiet after I finished. Ellen said, "Do not sign anything this Friday. Do not tell your daughter you know. Come to my office tomorrow morning at 8:30. I slept in my husband's chair that night, not the bedroom. I couldn't make myself go upstairs. The house felt changed, not unsafe exactly, more like something that had been measured from outside by people I thought were on my side." I thought about the timeline. 14 months since my daughter had introduced me to Clifton Marsh. 13 months since I had started occasionally forgetting small things, an appointment rescheduled and then forgotten, a name that wouldn't come when I needed it. Things I had told myself were grief and age, things I now looked at differently. I thought about the conversation in March, when my daughter had sat at this kitchen table and told me gently that she was worried, that maybe it was time to think about protecting what her father and I had built. She had brought printed materials. She had been kind. She had said, "I don't want anything to happen to what you and Dad worked so hard for." I had been moved. I had thanked her. I thought about Derek and the way he had always stood slightly behind my daughter in difficult conversations. Present, but quiet. Deferring. Whether that was temperament or convenience, I didn't know yet. I thought about my daughter. I didn't know yet whether she was the architect of what I'd heard or whether she had been led somewhere she didn't fully see. The difference mattered to me in a way that was hard to explain. It mattered the way the difference between being pushed and falling matters, even when you end up in the same place. Ellen Chow's office was on the 3rd floor of a building in Kamloops, above a travel agency that had survived everything and a dentist office that hadn't. She met me at the door with coffee in a paper cup and closed the blinds before we sat down. I handed her the folder Clifton Marsh had given me 6 weeks earlier. She read it twice, slowly. "The trustee compensation clause," she said, setting it down and tapping the second-to-last page. "If you sign this Friday, Marsh receives 1.8% annually from the trust assets as a management fee, with a separate advisory fees at his billing rate for any decision involving over $15,000. She paused. "On assets this size, that's conservatively $12,000 to $15,000 a year in fees alone, in a structure where he also has discretionary authority." She looked at me. "Did he walk you through this?" "No." "Did your daughter?" "No." She set the folder aside. "Tell me about Dr. Beaumont." I told her what I had heard through the wall. She wrote steadily on a yellow legal pad. "Have you noticed changes in your own thinking?" she said carefully. "Over the past year or so, anything that genuinely worried you?" I thought about it honestly. There had been a few things: a missed follow-up with my GP in August, a moment at the superstore in Merritt when I had stood in the cereal aisle for too long and couldn't settle on something I bought every week. Small things. Things that had frightened me quietly. Things I had mentioned to my daughter. "Who knew about those incidents?" Ellen asked. "My daughter, Derek." And I mentioned one of them to Clifton Marsh at a meeting in September when he asked how I was managing. Ellen set down her pen. She looked at the legal pad. "Someone has been building documentation," she said, "not to protect you." She stood and took a reference binder from the shelf behind her. She opened it to a page she seemed to know. "In British Columbia, financial elder abuse involving assets over $100,000 is addressed under both the Adult Guardianship Act and Criminal Code provisions for fraud and breach of trust. If Dr. Beaumont produces a fabricated capacity assessment, and if Marsh structured this trust to generate undisclosed parental fees, both are serious offenses." She paused. "If your daughter directed either of those actions, she faces her own exposure. But I need more than what you overheard. I need documentation. I need a pattern." She wrote a name on a notepad and slid it across the desk. "Gareth Findlay. 30 years in financial fraud investigation with the RCMP before he retired to private practice. He's in Kamloops. He's discreet and he's thorough." I took the paper. "What about Friday?" "You're going to call your daughter this evening and tell her you have a migraine. You've been getting them again since the autumn. Nothing alarming. Just enough to ask for a few more days." I drove home along Highway 5, through the benchlands and the dry hills, that I had driven so many times I could do it without thinking, past the small communities with their grain elevators and their hockey arenas, past all the markers of a province I had lived in for 40 years. I called my daughter at 5 in the afternoon. Her voice was warm and efficient, the way it always was. She said, "Of course, Mum, don't worry about it. There's no rush." I sat holding the phone and tried to understand how the voice of the girl I had read to, through 2 nights of fever, could exist in the same person who had said the words I'd heard through a wall that morning. Gareth Findlay arrived the next morning in a dark green truck with mud on the tires and wearing a canvas jacket that made him look more like a rancher than an investigator. He was 68, quiet, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people were lying and had developed a precise internal sense of it. He sat at my kitchen table and listened to everything without interrupting. He said, "The trust document. May I take a copy?" I gave him the folder. He said, "I'll need your son-in-law's full name and employer, the daughter's name, Marsh's registration number if you have it, and Dr. Beaumont's full name and practice information." I had most of it. He said he could find the rest. He paused at the door. "One question. Your daughter. Do you believe she understands the full scope of what Marsh and the doctor were planning? Or do you think she believed this was legitimate protection?" I thought about the kitchen table in March, the printed materials, the gentleness. "I don't know," I said. "That's the part I most need to understand." He nodded. "That's the right thing to need to understand." He left. Paulette came over that evening. We spread 14 months of documents from Clifton Marsh across the kitchen table and arranged them in order. The initial consultation notes from August of last year, the preliminary trust outline from November, the amended structure in April, the management agreement in July, the signing date confirmation 3 weeks ago. Each document slightly more complex than the one before it, each one following logically from the last. Paulette said, "He knew you were grieving. He knew you were alone on 60 acres. He walked you here one step at a time." At 9:40 that night, my phone buzzed. A text from Gareth. "Found several things. Can I come Thursday at noon? Bring your lawyer." Ellen arrived at 11:50. Gareth arrived at noon. He set his bag on the kitchen table and produced 3 folders. The first one he called the pattern. Clifton Marsh had done this before. A woman in Penticton, 71 years old, who had lost close to $170,000 in undisclosed fees between 2020 and 2022 before her nephew hired a lawyer. A confidential settlement. A woman in Prince George, 68, the same fee structure, the same sequence. A complaint filed with the BC Securities Commission in 2021 that had been investigated and resulted in a letter of caution. Not a suspension, a letter, and was still technically open. He targets women who have recently lost their husbands, Gareth said, and who have adult children presenting as advocates. Ellen leaned forward over the documents. The compensation structure he gave you mirrors the Penticton arrangement almost exactly. The second folder was Derek. Before he married my daughter, Derek had worked in financial services in Calgary from 2008 to 2013. Gareth had spoken, off the record, with a former colleague at the firm. Derek had left after an internal compliance review related to a client file. Nothing was ever prosecuted. He had resigned, but he had worked in that environment long enough to understand fee structures. Long enough to know which language in a trust document transferred control quietly. Long enough to understand what discretionary authority actually means in practice. "Did he bring Clifton Marsh to your daughter?" Ellen said carefully. "Or did your daughter find Marsh independently?" "My daughter told me Derek had recommended him," I said. "He said Marsh had helped a colleague at his office." Gareth and Ellen looked at each other across the table. The third folder was the one I dreaded. Dr. Lawrence Beaumont was not a geriatric psychiatrist. He was a general practitioner with a clinic in Kelowna who had attended 2 continuing education seminars on cognitive assessment in the past 3 years. He was not the kind of physician you call when you genuinely want to know whether someone's memory is declining. Gareth had found 2 other trust arrangements in BC over the past 4 years in which Beaumont had been retained as a capacity consultant. Both involved women over 65. Both involved the same Marsh fee structure. One of those women was currently living in a memory care facility in the Okanagan. Her property had been sold 18 months ago. Ellen looked at me across the table. I looked at the third folder. Was Derek the originating party in the Penticton case or the Prince George case, I asked. Gareth shook his head. Different families entirely, but the Marsh-Beaumont combination appears in all of them. Derek appears to have been the entry point in your case. Specifically, he introduced Marsh to your daughter. Your daughter brought the trust structure to you. Is there anything that places Derek in knowing participation in fraud? Ellen asked. Gareth was careful. He signed one document in July as a co-trustee designate. He will face questions. But the primary relationship between Marsh and Beaumont predates your family's involvement. Derek appears to have known Marsh through the Calgary connection, and to have understood how the fee structure worked. Whether he understood the full scope of what Beaumont was intended to provide, he paused. That's less clear. I sat with that. I had been sitting with the question of my daughter all week, whether she was someone who had chosen this or someone who had been chosen for her. There was a version of it where Derek had understood what Marsh offered and had led my daughter toward it gently. The way you lead someone towards something you know they want, but would not choose directly. I did not know which version was true. I knew that my daughter had said the words through that wall, I knew she had said actual freedom. I knew what she'd meant. But I also knew her. I knew what the years since the pandemic had done to their finances. I knew she had 2 children in private school in Vancouver and a mortgage that had been restructured twice. I knew what fear could do to a person's ability to see clearly. I had learned that watching my husband face his last year, none of that changed what I had heard, but it changed what I needed to do next. "I want to call them in," I said. "I want to reschedule the signing for Sunday. My place. Tell them I'm ready." Ellen looked at me carefully. And then I want to finish it. I spent Saturday making the house clean. I cooked a proper dinner, the moose stew my husband had made every October for 20 years, the recipe he'd adapted from his mother's and refined into something entirely his. I let it fill the kitchen with the smell of every autumn we'd had together here. I sat at his desk in the study and looked at his photograph. I told him what I was about to do. I told him I was frightened. I told him the frightened part didn't change anything. Paulette arrived at 1 o'clock Sunday. My neighbor Frank, not a neighbor in the city sense, his property was 3 kilometers down the road, but a man who had helped me split wood the first winter after my husband died, and who I trusted without qualification, arrived at 1:30. Ellen was already there with her assistant and a colleague from her office. Gareth sat in the corner chair near the bookshelf. At 2:55, I heard tires on the gravel. I stood at the kitchen window and watched my daughter and Derek come up the path to the front door. Derek was carrying a leather portfolio. My daughter was wearing the blazer she wore when she wanted to appear composed. Clifton Marsh's rental car pulled in behind them. He got out straightening his jacket. I opened the door and smiled. My daughter hugged me. She smelled like the same perfume she had worn for a decade, the one she bought herself every birthday. She said, "You look well, Mum. Is the migraine better?" "Much better," I said. "Come in. I made stew." Derek hugged me and said it smelled wonderful. Clifton Marsh shook my hand with his familiar firmness. He smiled the smile of a man who expected the next 90 minutes to go smoothly. I led them into the dining room, where the table was set and the documents were laid out. Paulette and Frank and Ellen's group were seated along the far side. Marsh paused when he saw the number of people in the room. He recovered quickly. "Margaret," he said, and I noticed that he used my name, the way people do when they want to seem like they know you. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting all your guests." "No," I said. "You haven't." I sat at the head of the table. My daughter sat to my left, Derek beside her. Clifton Marsh settled into the chair directly across from me. He set his portfolio on the table and opened it with the practiced efficiency of someone who does this regularly. "Before we get into the documents," he said, "I'd like to walk everyone through the final structure one more time, just to make sure we're all comfortable." I said, "I'd like to say something first." "Of course," he said. I looked at my daughter. She was watching me with the attentive, slightly managed expression she had developed sometime in her 30s, the one she used when she thought a conversation might need steering. 3 years ago, I said, "Your father sat in this room at this table about a week before he went into hospital the last time, and he said something to me that I've thought about almost every day since." He said, "Liz, you've given away everything you had your whole life. Don't let anyone talk you out of what's left." He wasn't talking about the right to make my own decisions. My daughter's expression softened. Derek was very still. "I kept that promise," I said. "This week." Silence. I nodded to Gareth. He opened his bag and placed 3 folders on the table, arranged carefully, the way he had placed them on this same table 3 days ago. I looked at Clifton Marsh. "6 weeks ago, you gave me a trust document with a 1.8% annual management fee and a separate advisory charge at your billing rate for any decision over $15,000. I looked at my daughter. "He never mentioned this to you because you don't know it's on page 14. My daughter looked at the folder, then at Marsh. Marsh said, "There may be some confusion about how the fee schedule is structured. If we could review it together," Ellen said. "The fee schedule is on page 14. Section 3, subsection C, embedded in a paragraph headed Standard Administrative Provisions. It is the same fee structure used in a trust arrangement in Penticton, British Columbia, that resulted in a civil settlement against Mr. Marsh in 2022 and in a second arrangement in Prince George involving a complaint currently before the BC Securities Commission. My daughter went very still. I opened the first folder and turned it to face her. Marsh's name at the top, the Penticton summary, the Prince George complaint. The two prior clients, both women, both recently widowed, both approached through adult children who presented as advocates. My daughter stared at the page for a long time. "I want to tell you about Derek," I said. Derek looked at me. His face was composed, but his hands had gone flat on the table, pressed down hard, the way hands go when a person is bracing. "Before you and my daughter married," I said, "you worked in financial services in Calgary. You left your firm after an internal compliance review related to a client account. You've understood how management fee structures work in trust documents for a very long time. You knew what this structure meant. You introduced Clifton Marsh to my daughter," Derek said. "That review was unrelated to anything like this. I resigned on my own terms." Paulette placed a printed document on the table in front of my daughter. I kept my eyes on Derek. "You framed this to my daughter as protecting me," I said. "Because my daughter loves me, and because she was frightened about money, and because someone who understood both of those things could see exactly how to use them. You used her love for me as the mechanism." My daughter looked at the document in front of her. Then she looked at Derek. He didn't speak. "And then," I said, "there is Dr. Beaumont." Clifton Marsh pushed back his chair. "I don't think this is a productive," Ellen said. "Please stay seated, Mr. Marsh." Two officers from the RCMP Financial Integrity Unit are currently outside this property. They have been briefed and are prepared to come inside if needed. Marsh sat. "Dr. Beaumont," I said, "is a general practitioner in Kelowna with 2 continuing education certificates in cognitive assessment. He is not a geriatric specialist. He is not a neuropsychologist. He was scheduled to evaluate me on the 22nd, after I signed these documents, and his evaluation was not intended to protect me. It was intended to create a retroactive framework to challenge my capacity to revoke the trust if I ever tried." My daughter said, very quietly, "Mum." I looked at her. Her face had changed entirely. The composed, managed expression was gone. She looked like the girl I had read to in the dark with a library book about horses, except that the fear on her face now was a different kind. Not fever. Something worse. I said, 2 other women have already been through this. A woman in Penticton lost $170,000. A woman in the Okanagan sold her property last year and is now in a care facility. Her family is paying for it with what was left of her savings. The room was very quiet. "I want to be clear about something," I said. "I am not confused. I am not declining. I am 68 years old. I taught in the school district for 24 years. I managed 60 acres of property alone through 3 winters before I turned 35. I buried my husband, handled his estate without assistance, and have made every decision about my life with complete clarity for the past 2.5 years. No one in this room, and no general practitioner in Kelowna, gets to decide otherwise." Ellen stood. "You are being referred to the BC Securities Commission for investigation of undisclosed fee structures and breach of fiduciary duty. You are also being referred for criminal investigation under fraud provisions of the Criminal Code. Dr. Beaumont will be separately referred to the BC College of Physicians and Surgeons." She looked at Derek. "The question of your involvement in a conspiracy to defraud is currently under active review." The RCMP officers came to the door. Marsh left without speaking. He looked, at the end, smaller than I had expected, like something that had only appeared large because of the documents around it. Derek looked at my daughter. Her composure had come apart faster than either of them had prepared for. She looked at him with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not grief, not anger, something more like the particular horror of recognizing yourself in a mirror you didn't mean to look into, she said. I didn't know about Dr. Beaumont. I want you to know I didn't know about that part. Derek said. I can explain. She stood up and walked past him and past me and out the front door without looking back. Derek left 20 minutes later after saying very little to anyone, carrying his leather portfolio still unopened, the way he had brought it in. The room was quiet a long time after the cars left on the gravel. Frank poured water. Paulette put her hand on my shoulder. Ellen gathered her documents with the clean efficiency that I had always admired in her, the way she handled every ending. My daughter called that evening from somewhere. I could hear road noise through the phone. She sounded depleted, the way people sound when the version of themselves they had been maintaining has become too expensive to keep up. She said, I told myself I was protecting you. I genuinely believed some of it. I need you to know that. I waited, she said. He started talking about the financial pressure 2 years ago. He had found Marsh somehow, I don't know when exactly, and he came to me with it as a plan. He said it was for your benefit, for the family's future, that you'd never miss what you wouldn't notice. I knew the fee structure was high. I told myself you could afford it. I didn't. She stopped. I didn't ask the questions I would have asked if the person it was happening to wasn't you, if I'd thought of you as someone with a lawyer rather than someone who needed a daughter. I sat with that for a long moment. That's the part we need to talk about, I said. Not tonight, but soon. In the weeks that followed, the quiet of the cabin returned. Not the hollowed-out quiet of the first 2 winters after my husband died, but something more inhabited. Paulette came on Wednesdays. Frank came for dinner when the road wasn't bad. I called my grandchildren on Sundays. Clifton Marsh surrendered his registration with the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada in November pending the securities investigation. Criminal charges were filed before Christmas. Dr. Beaumont's license was suspended in October pending a full college review. 3 other families came forward through the investigation. None of them people I knew, all of them situations that had gone further than mine before anyone intervened. Whatever happened in the courts, that part felt like enough. My daughter separated from Derek in November. She and the children spent Christmas in a rented house 40 minutes from my door. We ate around a folding table that had belonged to her grandmother and wasn't really big enough, and we didn't speak about any of it. Some things need a longer approach. She called in January and told me she had started seeing a counselor. She said, "She's helping me understand some things about how I saw you after Dad died, why I thought you needed managing, why it was easier to work around you than to talk to you directly." I listened. She said, "I think I needed you to be diminished so that I didn't have to feel how much I missed him. If you were struggling, I had something to do, something to fix. And when Derek offered a plan, I think I grabbed it because it felt like action." I thought about that for a while. I thought about the 3 winters I had spent not calling her enough, managing my grief on my own the way I had always managed difficult things, quietly, alone, doors closed. I had told myself I was protecting her from my sadness. I had told myself I was strong. I had not thought about what a closed door looks like to the person standing on the other side of it. "I didn't make it easy," I said. "After your father died, I went inside the way I do, and I didn't let you in. You looked at a closed door and decided I'd already become someone who couldn't manage it. That was your mistake." I paused, but I helped make the space for it. She was quiet on the line. "That's the part we need to keep talking about," I said. On a Sunday in late February, I drove out to the cemetery where my husband is buried. The hills were still carrying snow, and the light was that particular white that southern BC does in winter, when the sky and the hills and the distance all go the same color and everything looks stripped to its essential shape. I sat with him for a while. I told him about all of it, the wall, the folders, the RCMP in the driveway, the look on my daughter's face when the mascot came off. I told him the cabin was still standing. I told him his dock was still there. I told him our daughter was getting better. Slowly. The way things get better when the repair is real and not just cosmetic. I drove home along the highway through the winter hills. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment under the big Douglas fir at the corner of the property, the one my husband had strung lights in every December until the year his arms wouldn't reach. I went inside. I made tea and sat in the kitchen in the quiet that was mine. Not empty quiet, not lonely quiet. The kind that belongs to you when you've earned it by staying. I had the cognitive evaluation that Dr. Beaumont had been meant to prevent done in January voluntarily at the BC Memory Clinic in Kamloops. 2 days. A proper neuropsychologist. She told me the results showed no evidence of impairment in any domain. Memory, executive function, processing speed, all within normal range for my age. She said, with some amusement, that I had caught an error in her test instructions and politely corrected her, and that most of her patients did not do that. I didn't have the report framed. I didn't need to. I knew what it said. I had known what it said all along. But there are days, in the long quiet of a property you run alone, when grief looks like confusion and solitude looks like decline, and you start to wonder. And on those days, I think about what a particular kind of stranger did. A woman behind a pharmacy counter who held my elbow in the dark because she thought I should know what was happening to me, because she had decided that mattered more than being wrong. She still slips a butterscotch candy into my prescription bag. I have never told her how much that costs me, in the best way. Some things you say by going back.